Let us pray. Eternal God, in the reading of the Scripture, may your word be heard. In the meditations of our hearts, may your word be known. In the faithfulness of our lives, may your word be shown. Amen. Michael Williams talks about the Joshua story in terms of an element of carrying the faith. And he suggests that perhaps in our context, we may not think a lot about relics or artifacts that we'd be willing to put into a box or into an ark to carry with us. But we do have significant things in our stories. For those of you who have had to downsize and make the transition to a smaller place, you know about that. You know about those things that you want to keep and that carry such a significant part of our lives. The Ark of the Covenant, legend has it, contained the tablets of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And as I told the children, Aaron's staff that budded and flowered, and a sample of manna that continually regenerated. And each of these objects serves as a reminder of the story of the people's release from slavery and of a God who brought them out of bondage to the promised land. Relics, at least in this context, function as concrete reminders of parts of the story of faith and of a God who has brought us to this point on the journey. The objects in the ark remind the children of Israel that the God is a God who brought them out, who fed them, who cared for them, who gave them and formed them into a people through the commandments and through all of the other care. It's a powerful image, and it's an image that's used as in this difficult transition into Joshua. Because Joshua, you have that piece where they're going to drive out, God will drive out all the things, and you did very well in all those names, and all those nations. It's a challenge. Now, I've already talked about that. Archaeologically, there isn't a lot of evidence that ever happened that way in terms of how Joshua describes it. But it's a story. It's a story that tells a theological point about God's care and God's promise. It's very likely that archaeologically the evidence sort of points towards people running from slavery, moving from slavery into settlement. And the migration took place over generations and generations. But as you are living in particular contexts, whether it is the exile in Babylon, or the threat from the Assyrians a century later, or even in our own century, the Holocaust and other pieces, it takes on a particular context. What does this story mean for the people of God as they are shaped? So what are our relics? Those things in our lives that we carry with us that remind us that God has brought us to this point and God leads us. Well, 95 Theses, the burning bush, the dove, the Bible. If you haven't looked at the United Church crest lately, you will see those symbols, the Alpha and the Omega, or the piece that we say often, our creed, we are not alone. Are those the relics? And how do they help inform how we live? In 2016, photos emerged out of France. And you may remember the photos, but the photos were of 4 police officers finding a woman for wearing a burqa on a French beach, which opens up a whole different type of conversation. But what was interesting in that is that in social media, there was a particular response. And many people commented on it, and some not so nicely. But there was also a different nuance to it. People were posting images of nuns in full habit, splashing in the waters on the same beach. And didn't have to say a lot. It got at the hypocrisy of the laws of that time and the culture of that time. It's so important that we take time to remember and reflect on who we are and who we are becoming, and to have our sense of our past be deeply informed by the information and that's coming to us now. So whether we're looking at Martin Luther, and Martin Luther wasn't the nicest of guys. He had his faults and his foibles. He was a person of his times. He was deeply anti-Semitic. But yet, how do we tell the story and live the story in a way that informs our present faith? Do we throw everything out? Absolutely not. Do we learn? Yes. The Herald yesterday had an article, and the picture in the article, and that's what caught my attention, was Justin Trudeau laying a wreath at Passchendaele, the Passchendaele Memorial, 100th anniversary this year of Passchendaele. This remembering, whether it's 100 years or 70 years, and whether it's gathering at the cenotaph or gathering around the communion table. I hope that you saw the insert last week when we talked about Zwingli, who introduced within the 15th century, right around the time of Luther's Reformation, the sense of gathering as a community at a table and sharing a meal, recapturing the essence of our faith and what Holy Communion means. It is so important. And then for a moment, I want to talk a little bit about bookends or brackets. Bookends. Which is going to be, probably scratch your head. Where the heck is he going? In Mark's Gospel, one of my favorite parts of Mark's Gospel is what's called the discipleship piece. It starts with the healing of the blind man in Mark 8 and finishes with the healing of blind Bartimaeus in Mark 10. And the two healings bracket a whole lot of stuff in the middle. And Mark uses this bracketing or this bookending to say that this is really important. The particular two things that happens is that, first of all, Jesus heals a man, and the man says, "Oh, you're healed." Jesus says, and the man says, "Well, I see, but it's like trees. I can't see very well." And then Jesus puts spittle in his eyes, and he's fully healed. The second time, blind Bartimaeus is fully healed. The story, when you look at it in the context of everything that's happening in between, it's about disciples really screwing up and not knowing who Jesus is, and the predictions of the Passion. So it's a story about discipleship, a story about who we are, a story about how we figure out how we are to live in this world when we may not fully understand what this Jesus is calling us to do and to be. And so the first healing of the blind man is like the disciples. They don't get it at first, and Jesus has to spend a lot of time working on them. And then there is that realization, that coming around to sight. Well, that's what's happening here, is that we have a bracket of two major events, the crossing of the Red Sea and the crossing of the Jordan. And the crossing of the Red Sea, I hope that you remembered sort of the Haggadah that I used around that story, around Moses telling everyone, come on, come forward. Then all of a sudden stops them and says, you're not to enter that water and cross to the other side unless you cross as a freed people, as men and women and children who have been freed. Your attitude on how you are moving forward is going to determine and is very, very important to how we will proceed and how we will be formed as a nation. And so 40 years goes by, a whole generation becomes embedded in hearing and understanding and living out that story. And so as they get ready to cross the Jordan, as they begin ready to embrace their future and move to the next part of the story, well, how type of attitude do they need to have? You know, there's that sense of the priests coming and they need to wade in the water. They need to wade in the water to show that faith, and one of each tribe goes with them. And there's some other stories around that. It's wonderful. One of the Haggadahs, especially around this, is that at the end, when everyone is passed and the ark is finally taken out and the Jordan returns, is that the Haggadah says that the ark was impatient. It basically dragged the people who were carrying it out. It moved on its own. This story is a story that we need to temper because it's a story that talks about triumph and victory, but it's also just a story. I mean, what does wading in the water mean now? We know in some sense what it meant for Israel, for Joshua, and the generations and generations who have retold the story during exile, during the Holocaust, during the African American slaves that use this story as foundational. We shall overcome, we shall wade in the water. The LGBTQ community, how does this story impact them? The dispossessed, the refugees, all those who yearn for the promises of God to be fulfilled. Elazar Fernandez writes, our lectionary reading gives us an account of handing over a tradition. It recounts the story of Joshua leading his people on their final approach to God's promise, a land for a displaced people. The purpose of the retelling is not simply to report a significant event in the past, but to make it present in the lives of the hearers. The retelling is intended to monumentalize and memorialize an event so that it will loom large and become embedded in the memory of the people. In the liturgical recounting of Joshua's leading Israel across the Jordan River, reminiscent of Moses leading them across the parted waters of the Red Sea, the people are reconnected to a faith formation past that informs their anticipation of God's promise of a new and better tomorrow. What is the significance to this tradition to contemporary believers? The central theological message of this tradition is about a God who accompanies, protects, defends, and liberates the defenseless. It is about a God who fulfills a promise to those whose hopes have been betrayed by the powers that be. It is about a living God who confronts the mighty, scatters the proud, and brings release to the captives. Central to our reading today is the tradition of a God who makes a way out of no way. When all possible ways are closed, the God who has been with the people makes a way out of no way. In God there is hope for deliverance. The Red Seas and Jordan rivers of histories are not barriers to God's purposes. In God and with God, the people will overcome. For our community, for the Christian community, this story reverberates with so many nuances, so many hints to past stories. But if you really look closely, the central part of this overcoming, or God's decisive act of overcoming all the evil and all the horror that's possible, is the resurrection of Jesus. And it's something that continues in the lives of people who have embodied a resurrection in the midst of daily crucifixions. In being faithful to the God of the crucified one who has resurrected, they have become living embodiments of the Spirit that overcomes. When we struggle with the images that are coming out of New York City and other places in our world, one of the things that we notice is that one response can be to tighten and to close the doors even further, to blame. And yet, what about those moments, those cultural moments in which we can find a way to talk about being open? Talk about caring for one another. Talk about abundance rather than scarcity. We're going to be talking about a theme of stewardship in the next few weeks, and that's why the insert was there for you. I simply asked, if you were a gift, what gift would you be? Would you wade in the water? Would you sing, "We shall overcome"? What type of attitude out of the abundance of God's grace will you have as you move into God's future? It's just a question for some thought. Amen.